This move immediately fights for central space and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, setting the stage for active piece development and potential early tactical skirmishes. This move initiates the French defense, a solid pawn structure aiming to control the d5 square and prepare for a flexible development of pieces. This move establishes central pawn control, opening lines for pieces and preparing to challenge black's pawn on e6, a common hallmark of the French defense. This move initiates the French defense, a solid but often strategic opening that immediately challenges white's central pawn on d4 and aims for active counterplay. This move develops a knight towards the center and supports the central pawn advance, preparing to contest the d5 pawn and control key squares in the French defense. This move, nf6, is a principal response in the French defense, immediately challenging white's central pawn and preparing to develop the kingside. This move immediately resolves the central tension, opening lines for white's pieces and allowing for a more dynamic continuation, deviating from the main lines of the French defense. This pawn capture leads to the classical variation of the French defense, where white's central pawn structure is slightly compromised by the recapture, potentially creating opportunities for black to develop active pieces. This move develops the bishop to a natural attacking square, preparing for castling and potentially supporting a central pawn push or controlling key diagonals. This move immediately challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to open lines and gain space in the center, which is a key strategic objective in this variation of the French defense. This capture opens the d-file, inviting piece activity and potentially creating a passed pawn for white if black recaptures carelessly. This move recaptures the pawn, developing a piece and opening the diagonal for the queen and further development. Developing the knight to f3 follows standard opening principles, aiming to control central squares and prepare for kingside castling, while also preventing black's bishop from recapturing on c5 with tempo. This move is a standard and important defensive maneuver in the classical variation of the French defense, securing the king's safety and preparing for kingside operations. Castling kingside secures the monarch and prepares to connect the rooks, a standard developmental step after establishing central control and piece activity. This move develops the knight to its most active square, preparing to contest the center and potentially support a kingside attack while also eyeing the d4 pawn. This move develops the bishop to an active square, pinning the knight to the queen and creating immediate pressure on black's central pawn structure. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, supporting the central pawn structure and preparing to castle kingside. This knight maneuver prepares to potentially reroute to g3 or f4, aiming to pressure black's kingside or support a central pawn advance. This move is a prophylactic measure to prevent white's bishop from occupying the potentially strong g5 square, disrupting black's kingside development and piece coordination. This move repositions the bishop to a safer square, preparing to potentially challenge black's active bishop on c5 and maintain central tension. This move directly challenges white's well-placed bishop on h4, forcing a decision and potentially disrupting white's control over the central dark squares while preparing to recapture material. The recapture with the knight to c3 solidifies control of the d5 and e4 squares, offering better piece coordination than an immediate recapture with the bishop and preparing for potential central pawn breaks. This move introduces immediate tactical complications by challenging white's knight and aiming to disrupt white's central control, potentially leading to exchanges or further positional imbalances. This move repositions the bishop to a more defensive square, reinforcing the kingside and preparing to develop the remaining pieces while acknowledging white's centralized knight. This knight exchange simplifies the position, forcing white to recapture, and prepares to activate black's remaining pieces with greater freedom. This move recaptures the pawn and resolves the doubled pawns on the e-file, placing the queen on a more active central square. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to exchange it for white's knight and thereby weaken white's kingside pawn structure and central control. This move, QD3, retreats the queen to a safer square while simultaneously preparing to castle queenside, aiming for a more dynamic game. This move resolves black's central pawn tension by trading off white's most active bishop, creating a more harmonious pawn structure and simplifying into a favorable endgame scenario. This move captures the bishop, doubling white's queenside pawns, but it opens the c-file for white's queen and gives white a strong central presence. This move initiates an aggressive central pawn break, aiming to disrupt white's king safety by creating tactical threats and potentially opening lines for black's pieces. This move activates the queen and prepares to defend the d4 pawn while also potentially creating threats against black's queenside. This move aggressively challenges white's queen and aims to disrupt the opponent's coordination, but it also creates a permanent weakness on the kingside light squares. This knight maneuver prepares to reposition to a more active central square, potentially targeting weaknesses in black's kingside pawn structure and creating threats against the weak d5 pawn. This move repositions the bishop to an active square, challenging white's knight on e5 and preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside. This move challenges black's advanced bishop and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure for greater attacking potential. This pawn sacrifice aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen and rooks, in exchange for material. This capture opens the f-file for your rook and aims to exploit the exposed black king, disrupting white's pawn structure to create dynamic attacking chances. This capture on e4 is a critical decision to disrupt white's pawn structure and centralize your bishop, immediately challenging the strong white pieces that have advanced into black's territory. This move repositions the rook to the f-file, preparing to contest the open file and potentially support a pawn push or create attacking opportunities on the kingside. This pawn thrust creates significant structural weaknesses on black's kingside, particularly the light squares, while simultaneously offering no immediate tactical compensation. White reasserts control of the e-file, preparing to challenge black's active rook and potentially open lines for attack. This move f5 aggressively challenges white's pawn chain and seeks to open lines for black's pieces, particularly the rook on f8, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside structure. Capturing the pawn opens the g-file for white's rook, but it also weakens the kingside pawn structure, potentially creating targets for black's pieces. This move initiates a decisive counterattack on white's kingside by targeting the vulnerable g-pawn, creating potential mating threats and opening lines for black's remaining pieces. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to contest the dark squares and potentially support a kingside attack or defend the weakened pawn structure. This move seeks to reposition the king away from the central files and potential attacking lines that white has established, aiming for a more secure defensive setup. By simplifying the position with this queen exchange, white aims to activate their rooks on the open files and exploit black's slightly compromised pawn structure and king safety. transitioning into a more manageable endgame. This move initiates the endgame with exchanged queens, aiming to leverage the open f-file for the rook and improve its central positioning for future play. This rook move repositions the defender to the more active e-file, preparing to contest control or support pawn advances. The rook moves to b6 to target the weak b2 pawn and create pressure on white's queenside, while simultaneously connecting the rooks. This move aims to free the c3 knight and activate the queen, while also preventing black's b-flat 5 ideas and potentially preparing for an eventual c4 pawn push. The move actively contests the semi-open c-file, preventing white's rook from easily occupying it and preparing to challenge white's queenside pawn. Majority. The knight repositions to d4, seeking to exploit the weakened dark squares on black's kingside, particularly the f6 square, and potentially create pressure along the a7 diagonal. Black repositions the rook to the central file, preparing to contest the open file and potentially pressure white's queenside pawn structure. This move activates the rook to contest the open f-file and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, while also supporting the knight's control of key central squares. The king relocates to the corner, a less secure position, but aims to reinforce the queenside defense and potentially participate in the fight should black's queenside play become effective. This move solidifies the pawn chain and prepares to develop the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside advance or challenging black's queenside control. This move brings the king to a more active central square, potentially preparing to participate in the endgame or support pawn pushes, while also avoiding the potential discovery attack along the c-file. This knight retreat to e2 aims to regroup, defending the weak f2 pawn and potentially redeploying to a more active square like g3 to contest the open h-file, while also preparing to support a central pawn push. This move aims to mobilize the rook from its passive position on f6, seeking more active squares along the 3rd or 6th ranks to pressure white's queenside pawns and potentially create threats against the white king. This move forces black's king to move, potentially creating weaknesses on the dark squares around it and allowing white's rook to become more active on the h-file. The king boldly ventures forward to support the rook, preparing to contest the central files and pressure white's queenside pawns. This move opens lines for the rook to activate and control the queenside, potentially creating play against black's pawn weaknesses. This move aims to break open the queenside and create attacking chances on the b-file, while also potentially freeing the rook on b6. This pawn move captures a passed pawn, but critically allows black's rook to become active on the open b-file, potentially creating new threats and improving black's piece coordination. This move initiates a critical tactical sequence by activating the rook on the a1 square, aiming to exploit the open a-file and potentially disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and king safety. The current position arises from a complex queen's gambit declined, with white having surrendered the d-pawn for active piece play. Black's recent checks have forced white to defend passively, but this move rf1 repositions the rook to a more active role, preparing to meet potential future checks from the black rook and to control the f-file. This exchange simplifies the position, leading to an endgame where white's passed a-pawn becomes a significant attacking asset. The king is now active and can participate in the endgame, avoiding further material exchanges and heading towards the queenside pawns. With the queens exchanged and the kings having emerged from castling, this move activates white's king towards the center to participate in the endgame. aiming to support its pawns and potentially attack black's weaknesses. Nd4 repositions the knight to a central square, aiming to control key squares and potentially target black's weakened kingside pawns while challenging the rook on a1. This move boldly pushes the f-pawn, aiming to create a passed pawn and disrupt white's coordination, but it critically weakens the kingside pawn structure, potentially creating targets for white's pieces. The rook on h3 aims to support the pawn advance on the kingside and potentially target the 7th rank after further pawn pushes. The rook on g8 now controls the open g-file, creating immediate attacking potential against white's king and placing pressure on the f3 pawn. This move aims to consolidate the king's position and prepare for potential piece activity, anticipating black's energetic pawn push on the kingside. This rook check forces the white king to a more vulnerable central square, allowing black to potentially activate their rook on the open g-file and continue their aggressive kingside play. This move is a critical decision to either transition into an endgame with the kings in closer proximity to support the pawns or to prepare for further defensive maneuvering. The rook check forces the white king to a more exposed position on the back rank, setting up potential mating threats and further activity for black's king. The king is forced to retreat to a more passive square, allowing black's rook to maintain a strong attacking presence on the g-file. The rook on b2 now supports the advanced pawns on the kingside and potentially prepares to challenge white's pieces on the second rank, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares. The king retreats to a more secure central square, preparing to defend the pawns and potentially support a counterplay with the remaining rook. This move aims to create a safe haven for the king on the h-file and potentially disrupt white's piece coordination by threatening to advance the pawn further. The move 43, Kd1 is a crucial defensive repositioning, centralizing the king to better protect against black's advancing pawns and potential sacrifices on the kingside. The bishop repositions to the active f5 square, eyeing the weak h3 pawn and preparing to challenge the kingside majority if the opponent commits to advancing their pawns. This capture removes black's last active piece, simplifying the position and leading to a favorable endgame where white's king is better placed for the final push. The move recaptures the pawn, aiming to consolidate material and simplify the position into a potentially winning endgame, though it allows white's king to become more active. With the pawn majority on the queenside, white aims to create a passed pawn by advancing the c-pawn, aiming to exploit the exposed king. This move activates the king, preparing to support the pawn on d5 and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside while also threatening to invade white's territory. The rook now directly challenges black's advanced passed pawn on c3, aiming to either capture it or force concessions to control the crucial c-file. This move creates an unstoppable passed pawn, which is a significant advantage in the endgame, forcing white to commit their pieces to its containment. This move aims to centralize the king and prepare to defend the vulnerable d-pawn, but it allows black's connected passed pawns to advance further. This move initiates a critical pawn push that, if supported, could create a dangerous passed pawn, forcing white to divert attention from their already compromised king's position.